Assalamualaikum everyone. Today I'm back with another tutorial. Today we're going to be crocheting a 3-month-old slipper. So we're going to start with slip knot and chain 11 with this cute yarn which gives the cotton candy vibe. Okay, starting off with chain 1, chain 2, chain 3, chain 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then 11. We're going to be skipping these two chains, first two chain. In the third chain we're gonna insert our half double crochet 1 and half double crochet 2 in the same chain, and then half double crochet 3. Done. Then we're going to be starting with HGC into H chains. So here goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, then 8 into the second last chain. Done with HTCs. And into the last chain we're going to be doing 6 half double crochet. Here goes 1, a bit of struggle, then 2, then 3, then 4. I was trying to download something but failed successfully, but that's okay. Okay, moving on to our half double crochet. Here goes the 5th one, and then the 6th one. So we're done. Then we will be doing half double crochet. Here goes, let me show you. Half double crochet into 8 chains. Okay, 8 chains. So here goes the first one. Okay, you can hide the tail just like I'm doing. Okay, here we go. Then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, 7, 8, and we're done. And we're going to be doing a 3 HDC into the last chain. 1, 2, 3. And then slip stitch into the first chain. Here we go with the first round, and then we will start off the second round by 2 chains, and then 2 HDC into the first chain, starting with first HDC, then the second HDC into the same chain, and then third HDC into the next chain space. I'm trying my best to show you in details. And let me know in the comment section if I should go a bit slower or faster or anything. We're done with our 2 HDC into 3 chain space, and then we will be doing 9 HDCs into each chain. So that's what we're doing, 9 HDCs, and then 2 HDC into 6 chains like we did before. We're almost done with our 9 HDCs, and then we will be doing 2 HDC into each chain space. Okay, so here goes the second one. So we are going to be doing 2 HDCs into 6 chains. So we are at our third one right now, and then this is the fourth one. It's raining over here, so I hope you guys will understand the situation. And then fifth one. Now the last one, the 6th chain. 1, then 2. Now we're going to be doing 9 HDC into each chain again. Here goes first one. It happens sometimes with me. Here goes the first one, then second one, then third one, then fourth, then fifth, then sixth, then seventh, then 8, then 9, and we're done. Then we will be doing 2 HDs into last 3 chains. So here goes the first, then the second, then then the last one. And then slip stitch. Done. Then we will be starting our third row. Chain 1, and then 3 sets of 1 HDC and 2 DCs. So here goes 1 HDC, 1 HDC, and then into the second chain. Then we will be doing 2 HDCs into the second chain space. Then again into the third chain, we will continue the same. Into the third chain, we will be doing 1 HDC, and then into the fourth chain, we will be doing 2 HDCs together. Same for the fifth and sixth one. 1 HDC into the fifth one, and 2 HDC into the last and sixth one. we're done. Then after that we will be doing 5 HDC and 3 DC. So we're gonna start with 5 HDCs. Here goes second one, then third, then fourth, then fifth, the fifth one. Then we will be doing 3 double crochet. First one, second one, the third one. And then we will be doing 6 sets of 1 DC and 2 DC. So here goes first one, done with first set. First set is done. Like this we will be doing 5 more sets of 1 DC and 2 DCs as I'm showing. Then we will be starting off with 3 DC. Here goes first one, then second one, then third one. Then again we will be doing 3 sets of 1 DC and 2 DCs. Here goes first 1 DC, and then 2 DC into the same chain space, sorry, HDC. Continuing this till the end. Now we will be doing slip stitch and then we will be done. And after that, let me know how did you find this video in the comment section below. And if you liked my video, do like, share and subscribe. and stay tuned for more. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.